And yet it was a barn. What did barns rent for, anyway? And if it could be had, could they live in a barn? What were barns like, anyway, inside? Did they have floors, or only stalls and mud? There had been but two tiny windows visible in the front. How did they get light inside? But then it couldn't be much darker than the brick house, no matter what it was. Perhaps there was a skylight, and hay, pleasant hay to lie down on and rest. Anyhow, if they could only manage to get out there for the summer somehow, they could bear some discomforts just to sit under that great tree and look up at the sky. To think of Doris playing under that tree, and mother sitting under it sewing. Mother could get well out there in that fresh air, and Doris would get rosy cheeks again. There would not likely be a school about for Carol, but that would not hurt her for the summer, anyway, and maybe by fall they could find a little house. Perhaps she would get a raise in the fall. If they could only get somewhere to go now. But yet a barn, live in a barn? What would mother say? Would she feel that it was a disgrace? Would she call it one of Shirley's wild schemes? Well, but what were they going to do? They must live somewhere, unless they were destined to die homeless. The car droned on through the open country, coming now and then to settlements of prosperous houses, some of them small, but no empty ones seemed to beckon her. Indeed, they looked too high priced to make her even look twice at them. Besides, her heart was left behind with that barn, that great, beautiful barn, with the tinkling brook beside it, and the arching tree and gentle green slope. At last the car stopped in a commonplace little town in front of a red brick church, and everybody got up and went out. The conductor disappeared too, and the motorman leaned back on his brake and looked at her significantly. " End of the line, lady," he said with a grin, as if she were dreaming and had not taken notice of her surroundings. " Oh !" said Shirley, rousing up and looking bewilderedly about her. " Well, you go back, don't you?" " Yes, go back in 15 minutes," said the motorman indulgently. There was something appealing in the sadness of this girl's eyes that made him think of his little girl at home. " Do you go back just the same way ?" she asked with sudden alarm. She did want to see that barn again, and to get its exact location, so that she could come back to it some day if possible. " Yes, we go back just the same way," nodded the motorman. Shirley sat back in her seat, again contented, and resumed her thoughts. The motorman took up his dinner pail, sat down on a high stool with his back to her, and began to eat. It was a good time now for her to eat her little lunch, but she was not hungry. However, she would be if she did not eat it, of course, and there would be no other time when people would not be around. She put her hand in her shabby coat pocket for her handkerchief, and her fingers came into contact with something small and hard and round. For a moment she thought it was a button that had been off her cuff for several days. But no, she remembered sewing that on that very morning. Then she drew the little object out, and behold, it was a 5-cent piece! Yes, of course, she remembered now. It was the nickel she put in her pocket last night when she went for the extra loaf of bread and found the store closed. She had made Johnny cake instead, and supper had been late, but the nickel had stayed in her coat pocket, forgotten. And now suddenly a big temptation descended upon her to spend that nickel in car fare riding to the barn and getting out for another closer look at it, and then taking the next car on into the city. Was it wild and foolish? Was it not perhaps actually wrong to spend that nickel that way when they needed so much at home and had so little? A crazy idea, for how could a barn ever be their shelter? She thought so hard about it that she forgot to eat her lunch until the motorman slammed the cover down on his tin pail and put the high stool away. The conductor, too, was coming out of a tiny frame house, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand and calling to his wife, who stood in the doorway and told him about an errand she wanted him to do for her in the city. Shirley's cheeks grew red with excitement, for the nickel was burning in her hand, and she knew in her heart that she was going to spend it getting off that car near that barn. She would eat her lunch under the tree by the brook. How exciting that would be! At least it would be something to tell the children about at night. Or no, they would think her crazy and selfish perhaps to waste a whole day and 15 cents on herself. Still, it was not on herself. It was really for them. If they could only see that beautiful spot. When she handed her nickel to the conductor she felt almost guilty, and it seemed as if he could see her intention in her eyes. But she told herself that she was not sure she was going to get off at all. She could decide as she came near the place. She would have to get off either before she got there, or after she had passed and walked back. The conductor would think it strange if a young girl got off the car in the country in front of an empty barn. How would she manage it? There had been houses on the way, not far from the barn. What was the name the conductor had mentioned of the man who had built another barn? She might get off at his house. But still, stay, what was that avenue where they had said the railroad would come some day with a station? They had called it out as they stopped to let off the woman and the little girl. Allister Avenue, that was it. She would ask the conductor to let her off at Allister Avenue. She watched the way intently, and as they neared the place where Allister Avenue ought to be, her heart pounded so that she felt quite conscious, as if she were going to steal a barn and carry it home in her coat pocket. She managed to signal the car to stop quite quietly, however, and stepped down to the pavement as if it were her regular stopping place. She was aware of the curious gaze of both motorman and conductor, but she held her head up and walked a few steps up Allister Avenue until the car had whirred on out of sight. Then she turned anxiously, looking down the road, and there to her joy saw the stone gable of the great barn high on its knoll in the distance. End of chapter 1.